Vaccinations. 90% of the population wants one, 10% hate them. Should you implement them for your workforce? That's next on Employment Law After Hours.
All right, welcome back everyone to Employment Law After Hours, your favorite weekly series discussing the employment-related issues keeping HR professionals up at night. I'm Monica.
And I'm Brian.
And today we're going to be talking about vaccines. But first,
as an attorney, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we do have to put in a disclaimer, so please see the disclaimer below in the description for more details. However, nothing we say here should be used or taken as legal advice for your particular situation at your workplace. We're both employees of a law firm named Brennan, Manna & Diamond with offices in Ohio, Florida, and Arizona. However, we do have licensed attorneys throughout the country. So if you like the content of this video and you have more questions regarding mandatory vaccines at the workplace, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. If we're able to assist you, we'll talk with you further. So as Monica teed up, we're going to discuss mandatory work policies in your workforce. This has become a very hotly contested issue in recent times, obviously with the rise in the COVID vaccine availability. So a lot of employers are coming to us and saying, hey, should we implement mandatory vaccines for our employees, or should we allow them to be at the employee's discretion? This is a very important decision for employers to make. We're going to help you walk through that analysis of whether you should implement mandatory vaccines in your workforce. So to get things started today, we're going to discuss whether employers are permitted legally to require their employees to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. To discuss that further, I'm going to turn it over to Monica.
As the vaccine is becoming more prevalent across the country, a lot of questions have been popping up in the last few months about whether or not an employer is able to require, suggest, recommend, what have you, that their employees receive the vaccine. So there is no blanket mandate that employees receive the vaccine. But with that said, private employers or entities are able to move forward with a mandate allowing their employees to get the vaccine. But, it should be noted that as these issues arise and as more and more people challenge the requirement to have a vaccine, some states are in the midst of drafting legislation saying one way or another whether or not an employer can move ahead in requiring all employees to have a vaccine.
So essentially what's going on here is the federal government's not requiring you to get vaccines, and employers are permitted then to implement mandatory vaccine policies as long as they're not in a state that prohibits it. Off the top of our head right now, I can't think of a state that prohibits mandatory vaccine policies. However, as Monica said, legislation is coming, so you're going to want to be on the lookout for that. But at this moment, check with your local state attorney.
If you as a private employer are planning to enact some sort of policy requiring that your employees get a vaccine, at the end of the day, there are a couple of things to be mindful of. So the first one's going to be the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if for some reason you have an employee who, as a result of their disability, is unable to receive a vaccine, that is going to ultimately trump your employment policy requiring that an employee receive the vaccine.
So Monica, what you're saying is if an employee comes to an employer and says, hey, I have a disability that prevents me from getting the COVID vaccine, does the employer have additional steps then that they need to take to address those concerns or disability of that employee?
Right, Brian. So if that happens and an employee does approach their employer seeking some sort of reasonable accommodation or otherwise saying, for health reasons, I can't receive this vaccine, it's going to be up to the employer to then engage in a dialogue with that employee as to what can be done to sort of come to a mutual resolution. So that's your reasonable accommodation process.
So, Monica, is there any other limitations on an employer when it comes to implementing mandatory vaccine policies?
As you may know, there are several protections that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act affords people. And one of those is on the basis of their religion. So if you have a sincerely held religious belief, that is something that can protect you from a requirement to have a vaccine.
Similar to the disability exception to a mandatory vaccine policy, the deeply held religious belief exception essentially states that if an employee comes to you and says, hey, I can't get this vaccine because of a deeply held religious belief, the employer is then going to have to go through the accommodation process with that employee, similar to what they do for a disability accommodation. It's important to note that for a religious accommodation, again, this has to be a deeply held belief. This just can't be, hey, I'm an anti-vaxxer or I'm an anti-COVID-19 vaxxer. There has to be some sort of evidence that can be required to be provided provided by the employee showing that, hey, I have exercised this religion for some sort of extended period of time. Here are the beliefs of that religion. What accommodations can I receive? So possible accommodations for those employees could vary by workplace, but just some off the top of my mind, you may require that employee continue to engage in 6 feet of distance from other employees when the other employees don't have to. Or you may require that employee has to continue to wear a mask because they're not vaccinated when everyone else in the workplace is vaccinated. So again, similar to a disability accommodation, you can then go through a religious accommodation with those people as well.
All right, Brian, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the incentives that we suggest be offered?
Sure. So it's incentives for getting the vaccine is an interesting topic for the reason being that the EEOC has indicated that any sort of gift or incentive to give the vaccine has to be of nominal value. And they define nominal value to be very small, maybe a gift card of $25 or less, or maybe an additional vacation day, or giving the employees paid time to go get the vaccine or recover from the vaccine. So some additional PTO there. Interestingly, though, we are aware of employers that are going above and beyond the nominal value and giving out incentives such as $100 bills to employees who get the vaccine. So, there are employers who are pushing that limits to try to incentivize their workforce to get vaccinated just for the safety of everyone. There has not yet been any sort of testing or challenges to the EEOC's guidance of nominal value incentives, but that is something to keep in mind if an employer is going to evaluate whether to give those incentives, is to keep that at a nominal value. I also briefly touched on just there for a second that an employer can give PTO as well for getting the vaccine, the time taken to drive and obtain the shot, as well as recover. However, along those same lines, the Biden administration has also recently implemented regulations that will allow for employer reimbursement through payroll tax credits if an employer does give paid time off to an employee to get the vaccine and to recover from the vaccine if they have any adverse side effects. So the regulations governing that paid time off actually fall under the FFCRA, in particular the EPSLA provisions. They're still going to be limited to the 80 hours and to the $511 per day, up to $511 per day. That's what the employee can be paid as PTO for getting the vaccine. That's the limits of what will be reimbursed through payroll tax credits. And again, that's going to apply to any employers who otherwise are eligible for the FFCRA. I'm going to turn it back over to Monica, who's going to discuss some reporting obligations for employers whose employees do get the vaccine.
All right. So in the last couple of months, as people have been getting the vaccine and have been experiencing some of the more common side effects, aches, chills, fevers, whatnot, the CDC and the FDA have been doing their best to keep track of those adverse side effects to make sure that they are keeping tabs on what to expect sort of moving forward. And so in various ways, they have set up some different systems to allow for both individuals and entities to go ahead and report those adverse side effects. So one of them is going to be the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is directly through the CDC's website. It's a pretty informal portal. You just log on, put in your information, and they keep track of what side effects you're experiencing as a result of the vaccine so that they know going forward what to expect out of the larger population. Another one that's a pretty cool tool for individuals is going to be the V-Safe application. So that's something that you can download on your smartphone to essentially, operate in the same way. You can use it to report signs and symptoms so that we can keep an accurate count of, who's had the vaccine and what we're looking at.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that this reporting is not mandatory. It's just something that the government's asking us to do just so they can continue to track to make sure, hey, symptoms aren't starting to get worse, or maybe there's a strand out there that's affecting symptoms with the vaccine. So it's not mandatory, but it's just something that's available to employers to report if their employees have that adverse side effect.
Yep.
So Monica, have you received your vaccine yet?
I have. I am double vaccinated.
Same, and that's why we feel so comfortable sitting next to each other without masks. But
Yes.
We obviously continue to encourage everyone to wear masks, to socially distance. So hopefully we all can get through this and come out the other side.
Of course.
So with that being said, we thank you for tuning in to Employment Law After Hours today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Go ahead and click on that like button. And if you feel so inclined, go ahead and click on that bell so you're notified next time we upload a video. We'll see you next time.
We look forward to it.